Hi everybody, and welcome back to our Quiet Time series. My name is Maris Higginbotham, and I'm part of the Inland Empire region of the City of Angels International Christian Church. And tonight I'll be bringing you the 8th installment of our 2022 Fall Quiet Time series as we review the life application commentary on the book of Ruth, titled Called to Change the World by Dr. Mary Helen Sullivan. And tonight I'll be focusing on chapter 7, which is titled The Letter versus the Spirit. So, the letter versus the spirit focuses on chapter 4, verses 1 through 8 of the book of Ruth in the Bible. If this is your first time watching this series, I do recommend that you go back and watch the first 7 videos so that you can know what we're talking about and where we're going with things. I also recommend that you read the book of Ruth and Ruth chapter 4 specifically before watching this video so that we're just on the same page and talking about the same things, because I'm not going to go too into detail about what the scriptures say, but more so what we can take from the scriptures. Helen first talks about having an urgent heart, and she then follows that up with living out God's heart. Then she talks about, is the cost too great? Is the cost of following God too great? Lastly, she talks about having a spirit of the law versus following the letter of the law. So in the first section where she talks about having an urgent heart, we look at Boaz and how he's having an urgent heart towards helping Ruth. And really, he has no skin in Ruth's game, if you want to put it like that. Ruth is his relative, yes, but he's not, by law, responsible for her. He is actually second in line, and Ruth has no benefit towards him for him to be helping her the way that he is. She's a Moabite, she's poor, she has no social standing, she's not even Jewish by heritage, and there's really no call to help her other than the way that he's living out God's law, which in Deuteronomy and Leviticus, we see that God's law instructs us to take care of the poor, the downtrodden, the foreigners, the unlovable, the barren, and the widow. All of these things describe Ruth. So we see that right off the bat, Boaz has an urgent heart and that he's following the spirit of God's law. And it wasn't that Ruth was anyone special in particular for Boaz. This was just his lifestyle. This is who he was. He was a man that followed God. And so we pick up in verses 1 and 2 of chapter 4, and we see that Boaz drops everything that he's doing and he goes to the city gates. And the city gates at that time were important centers of social activity, as Helen notes, in biblical times. Transactions were made there, court was convened, public announcements were made. It's pretty much like the town hall, you know, if you want to think about more modern analogies. And so he goes to the 10 elders of the town and he sits them down to have a discussion about what's going to happen to Ruth and the land that belonged to their relative Elimelech, who is Naomi's former husband who passed away in earlier chapters of this book. So we see that Boaz was influential in Bethlehem because not just anyone can go to all the elders of the town and say, let's sit down and talk. Obviously, he had some stature in society. And we see that with this stature, he was able to do good things for God. And so next we see that Boaz was living out God's heart. And he went about taking care of Ruth and taking care of the inheritance that belonged to Elimelech. And he could have done it secretively. He could have said, hey, I'm next in line to take care of Naomi's inheritance, so I'm just going to take care of it. Just want to let you guys know. But he didn't, because he was a man of integrity. He offered the opportunity to the first kinsman redeemer, who is not named. He gave him the chance to step in and buy it. And Mr. No Name, as Helen refers to him, offers to buy it. But then Boaz says, oh yeah, and when you get the land, you also get Ruth, who's of childbearing age. Just throwing that in there for you. So because this man who was technically responsible for Ruth in biblical times, the next kinsman was supposed to take on the land inheritance and also the next childbearing aged woman to keep the family, the bloodline going. He has a wife and kids, and he's like, ooh, that's not going to go over well at home if I bring in a new wife and start over a new family. I already got my own thing going on. I can't do it, pretty much. So, giving him the full opportunity, laying everything out before him, Boaz says, well then, I'll take care of the land, and I will marry Ruth. So they switched sandals, which was the sign of biblical transactions, or more so transactions, how they were done in biblical times. They switched sandals, and the deal was done. Boaz inherited Ruth, and he got the total estate. Now, we see that when we're unreluctant to follow the spirit of the law, I'm reading from chapter 4 now, in section 3, Helen says, the Mr. No Name, the first kinsman redeemer for Ruth, is he was reluctant to follow the spirit of the law to take care of the poor, the widow, the downtrodden, the oppressed, God's family. And so because of this, God didn't want him to be remembered in history. He doesn't even have a name in this chapter. Like, we don't know who he is. He has no importance other than he's the guy that was responsible for Ruth. And instead of doing the right thing, because it was inconvenient for him, he chose to not do it. And he didn't want to follow the spirit of the law. And for that, God says, okay, we don't remember you then. So, next we see how Helen lays out what the spirit of the law is. And while I was reading this, I was thinking, what's the spirit of the law? Like, we're not even called to follow the law anymore. We're under the New Testament. Jesus died. We're under a new law, new covenant. Why is this relevant for us as disciples in this day and age? And it's because the spirit of the law hasn't changed. The law, as it's referred to, is actually the Old Testament. Jewish people refer to it as the Torah. It's where all of the do's and don'ts of how to follow God are pretty much laid out for the people in the Old Testament that were bound by the Old Covenant. And they're found in Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, pretty much anywhere in the Old Testament. They're given rules to follow. The Israelites don't follow them. They're given more rules to follow. They still don't follow them. God gives them more rules to help them stay faithful to him. They still don't follow him. And so the spirit of the law is love. And even in Romans chapter 13, verses 8 through 10, we see that love fulfills the law. It reads, "Let no debt remain outstanding, except the continuing debt to love one another. For whoever loves others has fulfilled the law. The commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, and whatever other command there may be, are summed up in this one command. Love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no harm to a neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfillment of the law." The origin of the law, the whole reason why we have it, why it was given to us in the Old Testament, was to help us to love God purely. And how we love God is by loving one another and following his laws. So when we're living by the spirit of the law, we have to be all in, which is an idiom that means to be fully committed to a task or endeavor, or to give or to be prepared to give all of one's energy or resources towards something. This is the heart of living by the spirit of the law. It means that you're all in for God. And this is from page 151 of Helen's book in chapter 7. So when we know the law and do the bare minimum to try to get by, when we know things are sin, but not really sin, so I'm just going to get as close to sin as I can, or I know I should be doing this, but it's not sin per se. Like, the Bible doesn't explicitly say that it's sin for me to do. I'm just getting by. I'm still going to be okay with God. I'm still going to have a clear conscience. This is not following the spirit of the law. Next, we see how Jesus he confronts the Pharisees in Matthew 23, verses 13 through 32. He confronts them for doing the right thing, following the law, doing what it says, but not having the right heart about it. He says, you snakes, you brood of vipers, how will you escape being condemned to hell? This is how serious God feels when we don't have the right heart, when we're not following the spirit of the law and we're just following the letter, when we're just doing what it says and not putting the love behind it, when we're doing things for the sake of righteousness towards in view of outward appearance or how other people might perceive us. But God sees the heart, and he sees that our heart is not following the spirit of the law when we're not doing things out of love for him and wanting to please him, when we're just doing things because that's how we know, or what the world may say, what religious leaders might say, how to do it. As we see in 1 Timothy, God is looking for worshipers in spirit and in truth. When we're all in both the truth, in the spirit and in the truth, that means that we are loving God with all of our heart, all of our soul, all of our mind, and all of our strength, as it says in Luke 10. And so this is God's call for us, as Helen says, for us to be all in heart and action. The spirit of the law is also to get the word out to all nations and to not just be easily satisfied with some growth as a local church. Like, yes, baptisms in your local church are great. We want to help people in our backyard get restored, to get to know God, to become true disciples of Jesus. But Jesus said to baptize all nations. And so part of being all in, part of following the spirit of the law, the spirit of God, is wanting everyone everywhere to get to know him as well. And part of being all in your heart and in your actions is, your heart is to go anywhere to preach God's word, and your actions are showing that you're all in by either going to those places or helping fund the mission teams that are going all across the world to spread God's mission. And so Helen shares some examples of how she was following the spirit of the law in terms of getting the word out to all nations, and how sometimes following the spirit of the law includes changing things up and really being in step with the spirit and moving how things need to move and when they need to move. She shares about how they changed their website around because they noticed that they needed to attract more businesses and community leaders, because they needed more spiritual leaders in their region of the country. When they were in Miami, they changed the wording on their website to attract more people with leadership qualities and characteristics, and it worked. In fact, in just 10 months, she says, by following the spirit of the law, God grew their campus ministry from 37 to 125 disciples. And she also shares that she had to reflect as she saw these miracles. She had to start to search her own heart and ask herself, in what other areas of my life had I lost my all-in heart for God? Where had I started to become like the Pharisees and become okay with following the letter of the law rather than the spirit of the law? She notes that following the spirit of the law will change the course of history. It will change the future of the world. And she implores us to search our own hearts to see where we might have lost the spirit of the law. And then she calls us to repent and watch God do miraculous things. So as I'm reflecting, I call all of you sisters to reflect with me and see, what areas have I lost the spirit of the law? What areas am I not all in? Where am I just getting by? Where am I okay with just doing the bare minimum? And let's step it up. Let's be all in. Let's follow the spirit of the law and love God with all our heart, our soul, our strength, our mind, and all of our capabilities. And so as we're called to change the world, we see that the key ingredient to this change is love, as love fulfills the law. I love you guys so much. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you all very soon. Bye-bye.